Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Ellen Johnston Laing, the author of Art and Aesthetics in Chinese Popular Prints, selections from the Move On collection. Welcome to Rip Rap, Ellen.
Thank you very much, Jim.
This program, as we've been discussing and preparing for it, is going to be quite unique. We're going to first discuss the context of these Chinese woodblock prints, and then you'll point out some of the details in the images used in your book. This book fascinated me because it focuses on a form of Chinese folk art, the traditional popular woodblock print that has nearly vanished. Could you explain why you decided to explore the artistic and aesthetic basis of these prints?
Well, you may know that I earned my PhD in Far Eastern art here at the University of Michigan. And at that time, when I was going to school, we studied such things as archaic bronze vessels, Buddhist sculpture, elite scroll paintings, and Chinese ceramics. And then after I and my husband spent about 2 years studying in Taiwan, I became very fascinated by the popular culture that was all around me there. And it wasn't until just a couple years ago that I realized this culture really had some good things to say for it and was worthwhile studying. So a couple of years ago, I published an article on the use of auspicious images of children in Chinese ceramics and in painting. And then more recently, I got more directly involved in the popular prints because I did an article explaining how these popular prints made around 1900 or so became a vehicle for promoting political and revolutionary ideas in early 20th century China. And today, I find that more and more scholars are beginning to turn to these prints for the light that they show on Chinese popular culture. So it was when I was working on these political prints and those that were political or revolutionary in content that I realized that a lot of Chinese and Western scholars had provided us with a great deal of information about these prints. We knew what the subjects were, we knew how these prints were used, we knew where they were made, the various print-making centers throughout China, we knew how they were made, we knew something about the history of each of these print centers. However, I discovered that nobody really looked at these prints as art. They never talked about them in terms of the lines, the colors, the color combinations, the organization of the motifs or the overall arrangement, and how those elements might affect the appearance and even the success of the prints. And in looking through the prints that I had available to me, I was aware that there were some prints that were very, very fine in artistic quality, and there were those that barely met minimal standards. So one of the goals in my book is to demonstrate that these prints are as artistically valuable and worthy of attention as all of these other so-called fine arts that come out of China today. So that's how I got started.
Well, and there's this wonderful story in how the prints were preserved over the years, because as we've talked before, they were kind of like the calendars that we print up now. They were produced in quantities depending on their type. And also the role played by collectors in preserving these prints.
Well, most of the prints today are in museum collections. The earliest of the prints that are still surviving are those from the 18th century, and those found their way to Japan. So there are several museums in Japan that have really extraordinary collections of 18th century prints. And some of these 18th century prints are also found their way to the British Museum. But actually it was the Russians who also began to collect prints. There was, for example, a Russian botanist who was in China during the late 19th century, and he collected, I think, about 600 prints, and they're now in St. Petersburg. And then he was followed, he was one of the people who pointed out that these were very fascinating prints that preserved Chinese popular culture. And then he was followed by a sinologist, as opposed to a botanist, a sinologist by the name of Elisef, who spent long periods of time in China from around 1900 to about 1920. And he put together a collection of 3,000 prints, which are now in various collections, in museum collections in Russia, St. Petersburg and Moscow and elsewhere. So it's very interesting that Russia has probably the most extensive collection of these prints, and actually some that are quite unique. So as far as the Westerners are concerned, a man by the name of Jean-Pierre de Bosque, who was with the French diplomatic corps, was in China during the 30s. And Dubosc was very well known because he collected Ming and Qing dynasty very fine scroll paintings. That is, scroll paintings of the last two dynasties, roughly 14th century on. And he also then became interested while he was there in these prints, in these popular prints. And his collection was sold recently to the British Museum as well. There are collections in Europe, in Berlin, in Hamburg, in Cologne. As for American collections, there are several Americans who were very instrumental in bringing these prints to the United States. And one of these people was a man by the name of Bertel Laufer. He was an anthropologist. He was connected with the American Museum of Natural History in New York City and with the Field Museum in Chicago. He spent a great deal of time in China. He was sent there by these museums specifically to collect things, collect Chinese things, and specifically, I think, to focus on those which would be of ethnographic and anthropological interest. So he spent a lot of time in, most of his prints come from the Shanghai area, and so the American Museum has, I would say, about 250 or so of these prints that come from Laufer's expeditions. Another person, American, who spent time in China was Lawrence Sickman. He was an art historian. He was one of the authors of one of the standard art history books dealing with Chinese art and culture. And he was, for a time, the curator of Asian art at the Nelson Galway Atkins Museum in Kansas City, and later the director of that museum. So when he was in China in the 30s, he also collected these New Year's prints, or these popular prints, and his collection now is in Kansas City. Another person who was really instrumental was a man by the name of Clarence Day. He was a missionary, and he began collecting these prints in China because of his interest in trying to understand Chinese popular religions. And he wrote a seminal book called Chinese Peasant Cults. And that was published, I think, in 1940, and then it was reprinted again in 1956. And that's probably one of the basic books, one of the basic places to start. So in general, you find that almost everybody who went to China and spent time there managed to acquire some of these. I mean, sometimes people bought these just as curiosities, and sometimes people went to a great deal of effort to amass a large collection. And Goodrich, for example, the wife of the foremost historian of Chinese culture, bought about 100 of these. She deliberately bought them because she wanted to find out what they were about, and she published a book on them, and her collection was later given to Columbia University in New York City. And the more I've worked with these prints, the more I discover that there are little bits and pieces of collections squirreled away in various museums. The University of Michigan Museum has, I would say, maybe about 70 of them. The University of Oregon has about 10 of them, including 2 very rare 18th century prints. There are others in Toronto, and so on and so forth. So every once in a while, a new sort of group of these things in a small museum comes to light.
I found it fascinating, like you were indicating, that there'd be individuals involved with putting together these collections, and then there'd be kind of an institutional dimension to it, and the same thing was also true of the Mubon Foundation. During the 30s in China, there was a growing interest in Chinese popular culture. And so people, including Westerners and Chinese scholars, were interested in going out, recording folk songs, or getting local histories, getting people to be able to record their lives and these sorts of things. And so you begin to find that, yes, even the Chinese begin to collect these things. Now, prior to that time, as you suggest, most Chinese, when they're done with them, they're ephemeral, we don't need them anymore, and they would sort of discard them. But now you begin to find the Chinese collecting them. And I think Wang Shangyi got involved in that movement. And the reason I say that is because he was clearly going to write a book on Chinese popular prints. He got as far as 1 chapter, which is still in manuscript. And the book, of course, was never published. So he collected these things primarily during the 20s and 30s. Then he moved to Hong Kong and to Taipei. He really was a businessman. He was born in Canton. He was a businessman, graduated from a business school in Shanghai. And so art was his sideline. He himself was a very well-known painter who did the traditional ink landscapes.
he was also a very well-known calligrapher. So he had his own art was shown in exhibitions in Hong Kong and in Taipei. So I find it very interesting that he would be interested in something as colorful and as far different from his own artistic bents as these popular prints, but he did collect them. Then he moved to the United States, actually to Ann Arbor, and this was after he'd had several exhibitions of the prints in Hong Kong. He moved here to Ann Arbor, and these prints were exhibited in Ann Arbor and also at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And then Wang died in 1972, and his collection then was taken over by his son, who lives in Kalamazoo. Well, meanwhile, Christopher Vanderburg had become interested in these prints, and through another route, which I will tell you about in a minute. So it was Christopher Vanderburg who purchased the Wang collection. So the Wang collection, you see, is now part of the Mubon Foundation. The Mubon Foundation, that's Christopher Vanderburg's organization. That was founded in 1997 by Vanderburg and a friend. And the purpose of the Mubon Foundation is for the propagation and support of woodblock prints and woodblock printing. So what this foundation does is they want to preserve 3 types of materials. One are the antiquarian illustrated Chinese books, books that might date from as early as, it's quite possible, as early as 1100 or so, but most of them somewhat later. So that's one of the things that they do. The second thing that the foundation does is to collect and preserve the popular prints, like those that Vanderburg purchased from the Wang family. And the third thing that the foundation does is to support modern Chinese woodcut artists who are academically trained and the work that they do in the People's Republic of China. So it has 3 sections to this foundation and the work that they do there.
How is this collection by the Mubon Foundation regarded by other collectors?
Well, it's never been published, so nobody knows it.
Oh, really?
So I think that's one of the nice advantages of this book, is to bring this collection, which is one of the best collections, I feel, in private hands, to greater public awareness.
I was really amazed. It is so colorful, and we'll be talking about the details. Well, unlike any other RipRap program we've done to this point, we're going to try to understand these prints by discussing them in some detail and even show them on the camera. I hope the viewers will indulge us while we try to do this. And as we do so, you can give some background on the type of artistic genre, when the art form may have emerged, what was its purpose, how is it influenced by other cultural sources, such as Chinese opera. But when we were previewing this, it was just fascinating. I think we spent the better part of almost 2 hours going through all the possibilities, and you've reduced this down now to some stellar examples. So why don't we start on that? And what's this first one?
All right, well, this first one, this is, well, first of all, let me say that these popular prints were indeed produced by the hundreds of thousands, and they cover a wide range of subjects and purposes. Images that were supposed to be put on the doors for protection, images of Buddhist or Taoist deities that might be used for private worship, other images that are illustrations to popular novels, which simply would be used for decoration. So this is one of the most important of the images, because this represents the kitchen god and his wife. Here's the kitchen god and his wife. And this would be pasted in a niche above the stove in the kitchen, obviously, and that's where the kitchen god could hear and observe everything that was going on in the house throughout the entire year. So toward the end of the Chinese year, toward the end of the lunar year, the kitchen god would have special dishes placed in front of him. His lips would be smeared with honey or something sweet to ensure that he would give a favorable account when he made his annual account to the Jade Emperor. This testimony, this annual testimony, was very important because it would determine the family's fortunes in the coming year. So let's look more closely at the print. Here's the kitchen god and his wife. Up here we have an upper frame surrounded by dragons, and here are 2 horses. The horses, of course, used to be the fastest mode of transportation in old China, and so that helps the kitchen god when he is sent to the Jade Emperor to get on his way speedily. And so here is the Jade Emperor's palace, rather perfunctorily done right here in the center. So the kitchen god would be sent up to the Jade Emperor by means of ritual burning. There would be some sort of a ceremony, and the image, this piece of paper with the print on it, would actually be burned. Hopefully then the kitchen god would go make his report. Then 7 days later, technically, the kitchen god would return, and at that time a new print would be put in that alcove above the stove. So this is, indeed is really a very, very complex image. When we look at it, and this is very typical of some of these images, we find that we have very large faces. There's no shading on the faces. This is sort of from chest upward, and there was no body. It really wasn't important. All you needed to do was to see the face. So in addition to the kitchen god and his wife and the calendar up above, down below are these three children who are tussling and fighting to get a hold of this official hat. Whoever gets a hold of the official hat, that sort of signifies that the sons in the family will pass the civil service examinations and they will become wealthy officials in the bureaucracy. Now, it's always important to have a calendar, and very often the kitchen god's images will have calendars. Now, what's interesting is that this very complex the blocks for this very complex print can be used year after year after year, because this area here where the calendar is could simply be removed and a new block, a new section with the new calendar for the next year could be inserted. So what we want to see here about quality is how fine these lines are, that they are smooth and unbroken, and the black is very black. And there's a multitude of colors: red, black, pale yellow, purple, and they are all pretty much within the black contour line, so that the color registration is very precise and exact. Another thing that is very interesting is that a type of gold was used for indicating the headdress on the kitchen god's wife, and for her jewelry, and for some of these baubles on his hat as well. This was not actual gold, but rather some sort of brass filings. So one of the things that we want to be aware of when we look at these prints is that they weren't just using print, ink, and pigments, but many of them are done in mixed media. I find this, I will also want to note the distinction that has been made between the kitchen god's features, with his rather stronger eyes and his sort of beetled eyebrows, and his wife's very feminine and gentle features, in particular her arched eyebrows. So all told, in terms of organization, the complexity of the coloring, the exact printing, both of the black lines and of the colors, I find this to be a very rich and visually a very satisfying print of very high quality. The second print that I want to look at is a print which represents the god of medicine. We know it represents the god of medicine because it says so right here on a plaque, which is sort of attached to this sort of shrine that he's sort of placed in or under. But if we weren't able to read, we could identify this as being the king of medicine, because down on either side is this arrangement of sort of a lotus leaf and then some other design. And here we have this diamond-shaped motif with a black patch in the center. And this is the medicinal patch so frequently used in Chinese herbal medicine. So this is another visual confirmation that, yes, indeed, this is the king of medicine. On the altar table in front of him is a full complement of ritual implements. There's an incense burner, and then candles on either side, and then further on either side of that are vases with flowers. Here the color scheme is relatively simple: red and green and soft yellow, and perhaps a little bit of some purple patches here and there. Nonetheless, the drawing and the line work is absolutely pristine and clear, especially in his face. Straight, even lines, very dark, very black, very exact. And it's interesting that his face is so precisely done and so carefully done, whereas the attendants are somewhat crudely and somewhat awkwardly rendered. Here again, we have a large face, minimal body. And in this case, we have a trio or a triad with a large central image and a smaller attendant on either side. And this is a very standard arrangement, a very iconic arrangement for placing the central, most important individual in the center and two attendants on either side. In this case, it was probably borrowed from Buddhist arrangements. And here is a Buddhist image. This one represents the Bodhisattva Guanyin, and it's labeled to that effect right here, Guanyin Bodhisattva. And bodhisattvas are Buddhist deities which are second to the Buddha himself. These bodhisattvas are individuals who have vowed to help everyone and all creatures needing assistance to gain nirvana. The most popular of these bodhisattvas is Guanyin, the one we see here. Now, like the medicine king, she has an attendant on either side, somewhat small. In this case, we have another example of mixed media because her face is golden. And in many cases, it was believed that divine figures have golden faces and should have gold visages. So how did they do this? Well, what they did was they took a sheet of gold foil paper and they printed her facial features at the same scale, same size as the original print. Then, after they had printed this on this gold foil paper, they obviously cut it out and pasted it where her face should be. This next print represents the Ox King. And this, to my mind, is sort of at the bottom of the scale of quality. Here we have, once again, the central head and torso and a figure on either side. All of this is just barely indicated. This is a sort of generic trio or triad. In the plaque up above could be listed any number of names of deities. This happens to be the deity, the Ox King. But there's no way for us to know that this is the Ox King. There are no other attributes or signals to tell us this is the Ox King. So that this plaque could just as easily read the Bridge King or the Horse King or the Grass King. So it's just sort of a generic deity print. In terms of quality, the woodblock is worn out, and the moisture from repeated applications of wet ink have contributed to the disintegration of the wood. And as a consequence, all these lines appear to be irregular and chipped and broken. For color, just 4 strips of red and green have just sort of been hastily brushed down on either side of the deity's face. So this is sort of the lowest level of quality. You can't get much lower than this without really disintegrating into totally unintelligible imagery. This one we might see in contrast to this extraordinarily elegant and sophisticated print. This is one of the heavenly official who confers happiness. This is a large print, almost 100 centimeters, so almost 3+ feet in height. To get a print of that size, they had to use several blocks and to fasten them together. And so you can probably see a break in the imagery right here. That's where 2 of the wood blocks were seamed together. Now, this large print of this particular personage would have been hung opposite the entryway in the main house, in the main hall of the Chinese house. And one of the things that's very interesting about this print is that although it is frontal, it's facing straight forward, and both feet are firmly planted in the ground, there is nonetheless a sense of motion. It almost seems as if this tall and imposing official is moving forward, and he's just unrolled that scroll on which are written the words that here he is coming to announcing that he's conferring happiness, bringing happiness to the whole family. And even the child behind him seems to be moving forward. As I suggested, this is one of the most elegant and most accomplished of these popular prints. And this print is also mixed media. It was done both by printing the black lines and hand coloring, applying the colored pigments by brush. It was made in an area in North China near Tianjin that was very, very famous as a popular, as a locale of a popular print industry. In this particular area, the print shops habitually would make a print it, and print the black outlines, and maybe print some of the color, but then they would farm the print out to the local villages where women and children in the local community would apply the rest of the colors by hand. Some of these prints, like this one, was obviously done by somebody who really understood what they were doing and did an excellent job. And so we can see the effect of the additional color, say in the shading of the sleeve, or in the additional red lines here along the folds of the robe of the garment. However, other prints from this area seem to have suffered from a lack of quality control and can really be somewhat sloppy and haphazardly produced. The last print that I want to show is this one. This is an illustration to an opera which is based upon one of the episodes in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And it tells the story from the 3rd century when a warrior by the name of Zhao Yun saved the king's son from capture by a rival king, Cao Cao. The son was tucked into Zhao Yun's bodice, and we see him right here. We know he's an imperial son because if we look very closely, we see a little black line that comes up here, and it gets wider and wider and wider, and it becomes this sort of red mist, and in the red mist is a dragon. And the dragon, of course, is the imperial symbol, the symbol of an emperor. So we know that he will become the emperor. There are many wonderful things about this print. Now, despite the great amount of stylization and exaggeration, this image is perhaps the most sophisticated and complex of all, because it cleverly conveys much of the excitement of the story in an extremely unusual composition. The action moves both from side to side and from front to back. The two opponents gallop past each other, Cao Cao going this way, Zhao Yun going this way. So there's this side-to-side movement. At the same time, Cao Cao from the back has thrust his spear forward, trying to hit Zhao Yun, and instead Zhao Yun grabs a hold of it and grasps it firmly.
It certainly shows that these popular prints were more than just inexpensive, brightly colored representations, as you say in your book, of prescribed figures or illustrations of stories. They have wonderful color. It also points out, your point in the book, that there's a whole element of art history. So I think you've really helped us understand some of the art and aesthetics engaged through these examples. Thank you for taking the time to explain these
thank you very
points.
much. I always enjoy talking about these sorts of things.